Hi, I'm Kristina Guerrero-Sisneroz. We're going live from my house, my carport. So wait and see if some people join in. Today we're going to talk about victims in general, and I'm going to try and keep this video right around 10 to 15 minutes today. That way they aren't so hard to watch later. Hi. As many of you know, I'm running for Justice of the Peace, and in that court there are victims. I did get a couple of questions that were posted on my page or sent to me. So I'll just start off with saying right now I'm a prosecutor, and I work at JP5 as a prosecutor, and the type of cases we see there are domestic violence. We get a regular assault or domestic violence assault, criminal damage, threatening intimidation, violation of court order. We get endangerment. We get hit and run. And so that's like if you're in a parking lot and someone backs out and hits you and damages your car. We also have traffic cases that end up having victims if it causes like serious injury or even death. They can come through and get restitution that way, and it's actually a Class 1 misdemeanor. Hi. So there's also shoplifting, where the victim is the store. There's also theft, which could be, if anybody steals anything from any regular person, that's also a crime. And there's also animal cases. So like if someone's injured or their animals are injured from someone else's animals, they can also be a victim as well. And so in Arizona, victims do have rights. It's actually in the Arizona Constitution. I posted that on this event as a link if anyone ever wants to look at what the Victims' Bill of Rights is. It kind of talks about what the victims have rights to. And so if anyone has questions, they can ask. Otherwise, I will kind of just keep going through some of the questions that were asked. One of the questions that was asked to me was about sentencing in misdemeanors and what's the maximum they can get. In misdemeanors, for just one, a Class 1 misdemeanor, the maximum they can get is up to 6 months in jail unless it's enhanced. The prosecutor will enhance it, ask for it to be enhanced if they've done it multiple times. Otherwise, they can get like up to a year for that, or if they're stacked, different crimes, different victims, and it was stacked, so it can add up. So sometimes people come in and they're a victim on a misdemeanor and they don't understand why someone can't go to prison. You can't go to prison on a misdemeanor. You can only get jail time. Some people, I think it was Terry Jo Neff asked a question on one of my posts about what victims ask a lot. And she was wondering why prosecutors don't always dismiss cases if the victim wants to have a case dismissed. And so as a prosecutor perspective, if we don't dismiss, we sometimes either have them do a class, or we consider the neighbors, or we consider the pattern and the fact that the police are being called out. And sometimes we're looking at, how often is this happening and that sort of thing. So if we have 5 different cases where the police were called and the victim is dropping every time, it's time something be done. Usually I try and have them do a class if it appears they have anger issues pretty early on, hoping that it'll, stop the cycle pretty early on. I think that's one of the important things about being a Justice of the Peace, is understanding a domestic violence cycle, and also understanding that it comes and goes, and then, they'll have a honeymoon phase and feel like, oh, things are great, and then it can happen again. And also understanding that sometimes, as I've done some teaching, is the victims, maybe not always the victim, they could also be using the police as a form of domestic violence. So it just takes a lot of digging through the evidence and looking at the history and stuff to try and decide what's best for this family, what's best for this neighborhood, what's best for the state. Because also when there are children involved, you get like DCS might end up getting involved. And under the child safety statutes, it's actually presumed that domestic violence is dangerous to children. So it's actually a pro se implication that it's dangerous to children, and it's dangerous to their welfare. So let's see, I have a question. What is the most serious victim case that I've ever dealt with? So that was not in JP5, but in general, I have worked in felony, and I've also worked for the AG's office. Yeah, and I would say there's two different types of cases that I've had that I thought were the worst. One was murder. Obviously, the victim died, and we were going back and forth with whether or not it was insanity or whether or not it was self-defense, those sorts of things, whether or not the actual defendant had mental issues. The other one that I think was horrible was victims were as young as 2 weeks old, and they were victims of sexual abuse, and so had to go through and deal with sexual abuse on children by their parent. And so that's some of the worst ones that I've seen. Those don't end up in JP5. JP5 is more like, you know, if a minor ends up in there, it can be just because it didn't rise to the level of a felony, or it was just something like the children witnessed something, witnessed, you know, maybe the parents fight. And so it falls under imperiling the welfare of a minor. You know, they weren't necessarily, and I'm not sure how to get that to stop going off. Who represents victims? If it goes to the county attorney's office, we do have victim advocates that help. And you can call the county attorney's office and they will give you the line to get to the victims. Otherwise, the victims basically represent themselves, or they can have an attorney, but the county attorney's office does represent their interests, but we also have to be separate and impartial and weigh the evidence and determine whether or not the case is provable and what's in the best interests of the state and those sorts of things. We can't just do whatever the victim wants. So I wouldn't say that the county attorney's office represents the victims, but we have to take into consideration, you know, their thoughts, listen to their side of the story. Let's see. I think I'm at everyone's questions. Do victims ever lie? That's a good question. Yes, just like anybody can lie, anybody could falsely accuse someone of doing something and they don't, and then, you know, you go through the case, and as you're picking through it, you can figure out that someone wasn't telling the truth. And in that instance, you know, it's the state's responsibility to get to the truth. And if it ends up going to trial, then it's the justice of the peace's responsibility, or a jury's responsibility, to determine who's telling the truth and whether or not the victim is actually a victim or not. I mean, that's part of the Constitution for everybody, is the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and deciding whether or not somebody actually committed this crime they're accused of. And that's one of the cool things about trial. Who's responsible for minors' rights? Usually their guardian, their parent. If they are in DCS custody, it'll be someone from DCS. But essentially, we go through either their parent or whoever their guardian is, and make contact with them, find out whether or not someone wants to testify or can testify, or what they want, whether or not they object to someone getting out of jail, or they want visits. I mean, sometimes a child can be a victim and the judge will put a no contact order, but the kids want to have contact with their parents, or the parents have the right to have visits with their children or whatever. And, you know, the contact has to be made whether or not this can be allowed. I mean, there's certain things that should be understood. It's hard to just explain right now without going into a specific case, but knowing and understanding that there may be pending criminal charges, then you're going to be looking at whether or not there's something pending, that if the parent had contact with the child, it could affect the investigation. And so then there could be witness tampering. So there's a lot of things that go into the victim's rights. What happens if a victim doesn't want to testify? Well, at the point where the county attorney's office victim advocates are making contact with those victims, you know, that's something that the state can take into consideration. consideration. What will that effective testifying do to the victims? And so maybe the victims will ask that you do a better plea offer or refuse to testify or whatever. We take that into consideration. But at the same time, we also have to take the seriousness of the offense in. So, for example, there is a statute in Arizona that prevents a wife, for example, from not being able to say they don't want to testify, so they're going to invoke their rights, because if they've called in the police for domestic violence, there's an exception in the statute that says, hey, you're still going to have to testify, and we can put them on the stand, and I don't know the word force, but they have to be on there, and unless they're going to implicate themselves, then they have to testify. Does JP5 ever do a court-ordered investigation to DCS? I would say that I have not seen that, but the officers or whoever's doing the investigation, if the prosecutor sees that a child was involved and may have been at risk, or the judge does, or any other attorneys or witnesses, then they should, because mandatory reporters are supposed to be reporting that to DCS, and then leave it in the hands of DCS. Call the hotline. Trying to figure out what other things people might want to know. Sometimes, one of the other cases that comes in JP5 for victims is registered contractor cases. So say I hire somebody to build my garage, and they weren't licensed, and they mess it up, and the concrete's all messed up, and I come out and my garage is falling apart or it's tipping over. The amount of money that it takes me to fix that damage, or get a new one rebuilt, or whatever I paid into it, or I pay a contractor that never even comes back, I have the right to get that money back. So that's going to come through a registered contractor case. Victim compensation. Someone just asked, what is victim compensation? Essentially, giving someone compensation for the injury that they've incurred. You can get that. There is a victim compensation program through the county attorney's office, the victim comp program. You fill out a form and apply for that. And sometimes if the defendant, say, goes to prison or doesn't have the money to pay you, you can get a form of compensation. Victims do have the right to be informed of what's going on. They have the right to be informed of the plea agreement that's going to be offered. They have the right to be heard. They have the right to know when the case is going to go to trial. Does JP5 handle evictions? Yes, they do. Tracy just asked, does the JP5 handle evictions? Yeah, they do landlord-tenant and small claims as well. So I don't know how long I've been going at this point. I don't want to talk too long. I feel like I talk too long. I mean, I've had one of these go a whole hour. So if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to PM me or ask questions on this thread. Next time I'm going to do drilling of me. Basically, anybody that wants to volunteer, contact me ahead of time, and you can be someone that asks me 20 questions, and I'll answer them, yes or no answers. And I ultimately like to have 3 or 4 people do that. It'd be like a quick lightning type thing. Maybe you can get to know me a little better. Otherwise, you guys stay safe. Hopefully, as soon as the COVID stuff is under control and we can start going and talking to people, we'll have more events, meet the candidate thing, things like that. Anybody wants to message me or talk to me, feel free to. I'm here. Okay, thank you and stay safe.